Good morning, everyone. It is a distinct and almost humbling privilege to be in this historical, magnificent, and dignified setting. Thank you so much for making this possible and for including me here. A few years ago, I had an epiphany, a discovery, an experience that changed me. And that happened in Norway, and it happened because the government of Norway is a full participating member in the research programs of the European Union, even though the country of Norway is not a member of the European Union. And that membership, that participation on the part of the Norwegian government involves taking very large amounts of money and moving them to Brussels. And the Norwegian government, like any other government, then entrusts its researchers with the responsibility to bring that money back. But in Norway, perhaps the strongest cultural value is the value of egalitarianism. We're all the same. We all have the same rights. The system should treat us equally. Our salary range is very small. In many, many, many ways, Norwegian society is built around the concept of equal opportunity. And that's also true at universities. It's also true at research centers. It is difficult for Norwegians to think about giving more funding to one group and less funding to another. Everybody should have the same opportunity. And the result of that kind of policy is that you can have very many pretty good research groups. And in Norway, we're very comfortable with the idea of pretty good. But when you're competing internationally, when you're competing in the context of the European Union, when you're competing with the best of the best, pretty good doesn't pay the rent. So the government of Norway decided to try something different. They decided to try to actually make a special investment in a few groups. And they initiated something that we see in many countries in Europe called a Center of Excellence program. And at the time that they initiated that program, I was relaxing in my office in Tromsø, in the high north, the northernmost university in the world, in fact. And this announcement came out, and I met some of my colleagues for coffee, and we sat there and we said, well, Center of Excellence, surely they're talking about us. So we wrote a few lines, well, actually a few pages. We sent it in. We got some response. We wrote it up again. We changed everything. About a year later, one afternoon, my director of research called me up and she said, Kurt, I can't tell you why, but tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock, you have to be at a press conference in Oslo. And I thought, I know what this is about. And that was a really big deal. I knew that at that press conference, they were going to announce who was receiving the Centers of Excellence. So I packed my bag and I jumped on a plane and I went to Oslo and I found my way to the university. And we were supposed to be there a little bit early because the Crown Prince would be participating in this press conference, which seemed like a level of commitment to science that I was unfamiliar with. And I went into this auditorium where there were room for 1,000 people, and it was packed. I thought, my God, these people really care about science. And in fact, I looked around the room and I saw that about 2/3 of the room was filled with school children. And then I was even more impressed with the level of engagement there. But I quickly realized that that press conference wasn't just to announce the winners of the Center of Excellence competition. It was also to announce the winners of another competition, the Curious Pete competition, which is an annual competition our research council organizes for school children. So all those school children there had been working for a year to try to win this competition, and in fact, the Crown Prince was there to give the kids their award and not to announce the Centers of Excellence. But in any event, they started with us. Our Minister of Education got up and she said, "This is a big day for science in Norway. We have been working for 2 years to decide who should get special conditions. Here we are, ready to go, the creme de la creme of the Norwegian system. And I'd now like to ask the new directors of the new centers to come join me on the stage." Well, I hadn't even met most of those directors yet, but I got up and I straightened my tie and I went down front and I lined up and I looked up the line and I looked down the line, and as I was straightening my tie, everybody else was straightening theirs. All 13 of us, men. And I thought to myself, where are they? Where are the women? Why aren't they here? And as if that weren't bad enough, the minister then turned to these school children and she said, "Dear school children, you've been working all year to become better scientists, to understand how research works, to figure out and make new discoveries about the world. You've done so well, and look, here, it's your future. The world awaits you. Just keep going, and you too can stand up here with me." And I thought to myself, we're supposed to be a picture of the promise of the future, and I felt much more like a stiff painting from a unfortunately not forgotten past. And as I thought about that more and more, I realized that we were not only failing the girls who were in that room, although we certainly were doing that. They had no opportunity to see role models who looked like them. There's a rich research on the effect of role models. It makes a big difference. One of the many reasons that young women don't choose careers in science is because they have no experiential basis for believing that they will be welcome there. But we weren't failing just the girls, we were failing the boys too. How so? Well, we were failing the boys because they were being shown a picture of a future that also is not theirs. They're not going to go into workplaces that are only not just dominated by men, but exclusively men. We were giving a terrible picture of the future of science there. And I felt embarrassed. It wasn't made any better by the fact that the minister was a woman, standing there saying, "Come on, boys, you can do it." It wasn't any better knowing that women have different challenges in their careers than men, and we were all who stood there professors in the Norwegian system, but 20% at that time, 20% of the professors were women. You could have expected at least a couple of those centers to be headed by women. I'm a professor and a researcher. It's true that I have these other roles in the Norwegian system, that I have the opportunity to try to create great conditions for research for others. But in my heart, I'm a researcher, and I want to understand what's happening around me. And when I had that epiphany at the time the Centers of Excellence were announced, I felt that I wanted to understand that. How could that happen? I think that's important, and that started me down a path that I'm still on, and that I hope that you'll join me on if you're not there yourself. I think it's important to try to understand if that particular result was in any way the result of processes which disfavor women. And to try to understand that, we have to start thinking carefully about what an academic career looks like. How do you become a professor? How do you become the head of a Center of Excellence? How do you win a grant in Horizon 2020? You do well in school, probably. You apply eventually for admissions to a PhD program. You sell yourself to a supervisor who will bring you into his or her research group. If that goes well, you apply for funding as a postdoc. Maybe you move someplace to take a 2-year position, and then move the next place to take the next 2-year position. And then you're on a roll, so you can move a few more places for 2-year positions. Well, you're a postdoc. The second you start that 2-year position, you better be sending articles to a journal because you have to apply for a new job in 2 years that's going to be based on your production in your current job. And when you send those articles in, you need to be ready to go into battle with your supervisor about who should be the first author. Because in these articles that we write, we care about things like the order of authors, and that's going to make a difference for your next job. Finally, you might get a permanent job if you win the lottery, and at some point you have to apply for promotion, and at some point that will be dependent on getting grants, which is what the whole Center of Excellence story is about. These are the steps in the process of an academic career that we need to look at and try to understand if we have any hope of understanding why there were no women at that press conference standing up front. Maybe there's more to the story, maybe there's less, maybe some of these issues, some of these steps are relevant, maybe some of them aren't. But I want to understand them. I want to know how that works. So how can we do that? How can we progress as we try to understand what's going on in academic careers? Well, we can look at what other people do. We can gather stories from each other. Sometimes this is called best practices. And we can look to the research literature. In fact, we're researchers. It is crazy to make policy at universities and in research councils that is not based on research. The pain of the irony of that situation is almost unbearable. So we must have research-based policy about research. But stories are important. Best practice is important. Sometimes stories touch our hearts while research touches our minds. They're both important. It's very important to be clear about when you're listening to a story and when you're listening to research results. And in fact, it's easy to confuse them. I feel like they get confused so often that I've found a name for the confusion of stories and research. I like to call them anecdata. An anecdote that gets repeated so often it becomes data. These are confusions that arise when stories get treated as research. Stories like, well, we had a woman president one time, but that didn't really work out. Stories like, when I talk to young women, they don't want quotas. They just want to be judged on what they do. Stories like, we tried hiring more women, but the women who were already there, they didn't even like that. Now, there is some serious maliciousness lurking behind statements like that. An underrepresented group is being told that in order to get ahead, they have to play the same game as the majority group. So some of them do, including allowing themselves to make negative comments about individuals in the underrepresented group, their own group. And then those negative comments are used by members in the overrepresented group to justify a lack of engagement in changing the balance. This is what is called blaming the victim. And it's malicious. So let's get away from anecdata. Let's have a look at some research, and let's have a look at some stories too, but let's be clear about what we're doing. So, what about those centers of excellence? What kind of career gets you there, and what happens to women along the way? I want to turn now to share with you a few research results. Research on career paths takes two general shapes, has two general shapes. Some research is based on real data. You look at a large quantity of data about actual progressions. I saw that somebody had the she figures from the European Commission on their lap over here. That's looking at real data about the career progression of women. That's one kind of research. Another kind of research is simulations. You try to simulate a promotion situation. You hold constant as many factors as you can and see if you can identify what's making some particular difference. I'd like to give you a taste of both of these kinds of research. But what is undeniable at this point is that there is a considerable literature making a strong case that men and women are treated differently. They are treated differently when we hire them. They are treated differently when they are our colleagues. They are treated differently when we evaluate them, and they are certainly treated differently when we promote them. So let me start with a simulation study, an example of a simulation study, which has become quite known after the last few years. Maybe some of you know it. It was published in a journal called The Proceedings of the National Academies of Science, a serious forum. In this study, a group of researchers wrote a fictitious resume that was going to represent an early career scientist applying for a position to direct a research lab. And they sent that resume to several hundred professors in the United States, and they asked them to evaluate that resume. They said, "Would you hire this person? If you would hire the person, how much would you pay them? If you think they need extra mentoring, would you be willing to give them extra mentoring? Do you think they would fit in with your group?" Those were the questions they asked. They sent out the resume. Everybody got the exact same resume to evaluate, except for one thing. Take a guess, the name at the top. Sometimes it was John, sometimes it was Jennifer. Half of the male professors got John, half of the male professors got Jennifer, half of the female professors got John, half of the female professors got Jennifer. And they sent in their results, and they were studied. And it turned out much better for John than it did for Jennifer. Men and women alike were more likely to hire John than Jennifer. When they did hire Jennifer, they gave her a lower salary, 20% or so. When they did hire Jennifer, they were less likely to offer her mentoring. The only thing Jennifer had going for her was that they liked her better. One very important aspect of the result of this study is that there was no difference between male and female professors in terms of their evaluation of those applicants. So it's not simply the case that getting more women to the top makes it better for young women. It's not simply the case. It's part of the story, but it's not simply the case. This is the kind of study that I have in mind when I say one approach to researching this issue is through simulations. That's a simulation study. As I noted, another result is to look at real data. Let me share with you one example of that, published several years ago, about 10 years ago, I guess, in the journal Nature, one of the leading scientific journals in the world. The study that's published in Nature examines what happens to young PhDs in medicine in Sweden who apply to get a postdoc from their research council. Now, Sweden is one of those places, it's almost as good as Norway when it comes to gender equality and things like that. And it's a place that we stereotypically associate with equality, with opportunities for women. The researchers actually had to push hard to get their hands on the real evaluations, but they were able to use various kinds of laws requiring transparency in the public sector to get the actual evaluations used for assessing the applicants. And they went through an elaborate process that I won't describe here, but which is described in the article in Nature, where they developed a system for comparing resumes, comparing CVs of applicants, especially looking at their publication history, where they were publishing and how to weigh that, and so on. And the result of that study is that when a committee considered a male applicant and a female applicant to be equally well qualified, the woman had published about 2.5 times as many articles as the man. So the single thing that matters the most in getting a postdoc in the allegedly objective process is your publication record. Women had to do more than twice as good as men to be considered equally qualified. In Sweden. About 3 years ago, a kindred study emerged from Spain. In Spain, there was a period when all promotions in the higher education system were funneled through one central office. It sounds like a ridiculously bureaucratic system, but it was a beautiful opportunity to collect data on promotions. And they allowed researchers to study 35,000 promotion applications and to examine those from various perspectives. And in that study from Spain, they also revealed almost the same number. A woman had to have slightly more than twice as many publications to be considered equally well qualified. We expect more of women. We do not treat men and women the same. Another real data study, now moving a little bit closer to my own field of linguistics, was published last year. This was a study from the high-tech field, not from academia, but from high-tech companies, where researchers gathered several hundred, maybe even several thousand, performance reviews, written reviews of the performance of individual employees. And some interesting gender politics emerged from their evaluation. Now, a performance review, of course, is going to include some critical feedback. That's the nature of the exercise. Of all of those several hundred reviews that they looked at, about 70% of them did contain critical feedback. There was a difference between the men and women, and it wasn't small. About 60% of men received critical feedback, about 90% of women received critical feedback. And I don't want to trivialize that, but that's far from the worst result of this study. The most shocking result from this study comes from the nature of the feedback. What kind of feedback is the individual employee receiving? And many employees received negative feedback on personal characteristics. You speak too loudly. Maybe you should tone it down a bit. You're a bit too eager at meetings. Sometimes you dress in ways that aren't entirely professional. That kind of thing. Those are personal feedback, let's say. About 2% of men got that kind of feedback. Over 70% of women got that kind of feedback. The gender of the manager involved was irrelevant. Here are 4 words that appeared frequently in the reviews of women. Only one of them appeared in reviews of men. You tell me which one. Here are the 4 words: bossy, abrasive, strident. I'm testing the interpreters. And aggressive. Bossy, abrasive, strident, and aggressive. Which one of those will you ever find in the review of a man? Tell your neighbor. Which one? Bossy, abrasive, strident, aggressive. The only one you ever find in the review of men is aggressive. And of course, that means something very different for men than it does for women. But we can go into that another time. We give critical feedback to men and to women. In addition to that, we tell women to sit down and shut up. That is not a system that you should bet on if you're going to bet on excellence. Well, I really enjoy the literature on this kind of thing, and I write about it a lot, and if you're interested in it, you can look at my blog. If you Google Kurt Rice blog, you will find it. I tweet about it. You can follow me on Twitter. And as Marcella said in the introduction, I actually write about other things there too. I write about leadership and I write about open access. And I only mention that not as an advertisement, but because there is actually a connection. I find that I'm deeply fascinated by the phenomenon of bias, by situations in which we think we're going in this direction and unknown factors pull us off our path. And that happens in scientific publication in ways we could talk about another time. And that happens in connection with gender issues and minority issues in the workplace. Some of you who are listening to this, I predict, are asking yourselves, isn't this ultimately just about motherhood? Isn't it ultimately biological, the explanation? And I'd like to say 2 things, or 3, or maybe 4, to that kind of argumentation. First of all, what if it's true? What if it's true that women who become mothers miss a few crucial years of their careers? What if it's true in science, in academia, that publication during the early years of a career actually does correlate with the ultimate trajectory of that individual career? Suppose that's true. In fact, it probably is. How should we respond to that? One way we could respond to that is to say, sorry girls, this is how it works. This is how the game is played. You got to make your choice. Opt in or opt out. It's up to you. We'd love to have you here, but this is how it works. In my childhood dialect, I would say, put up or shut up. That's one response. And to that response, I want to say, really? Is that the best we have? There's another response I can imagine, and it goes like this. Oh my God, what are we doing? We have built a system for doing science in which a woman who decides to have a child will never have a career that is as visible as the career of a man. She will never have the same opportunities as a man. How crazy is that? Why on earth would we build a system that effectively removes half of the population from participation? We're missing out on half the brain power of our society. This system must be changed. That's also a possible response. We could do that. By the way, what about men who want to take time off when they have children? I took half a year off when my son was a baby. And, it's damaged my career tremendously, but okay, here I am, and I don't feel so bad about that. Actually, Norway requires fathers to take 2 months of leave when their children are born. In fact, more than 2 months, 10 weeks, I think. It doesn't damage society, it makes society better. Now, if you think that biology and motherhood are crucial parts of the story, then you are either comfortable with the idea that smart women who want to become mothers cannot have equally valuable careers, ever, their whole career, not just those few years. And if you don't believe that, then you better be working hard trying to change this system. And if you are in a leadership position, you better be on the second track, or else you are squandering national resources. And that, dear colleagues, is not acceptable. Your institution is underperforming because you are not fixing this situation. And as we stand here today in the Senate, we should be held accountable for what we're doing. And if we're not fixing this situation, we are wasting our compatriots' resources. A second point about motherhood, now getting back to the research, this time a simulation study, a fantastic article from the American Journal of Sociology called "Is There a Motherhood Penalty?" Participants in that study rated fictitious job applicants by reading a whole file about someone applying for a job. And those files were constructed based on other research about how to communicate subtly whether or not a person was a parent. So some resumes would include things like, under your list of activities, they would say, one of my activities is that I'm a member of the Parent-Teacher Association. Or others would say, I'm a fundraiser in my political party. And this had been shown through other research studies to effectively convey whether someone is a parent or not. So they read these files, they were given subtle hints about parenthood, and then they rated the applicants based on competency and commitment. And the results are clear, and I'd like to read 2 sentences to you from that article. Mothers were judged as significantly less competent and committed than women without children. Mothers were also held to harsher performance and punctuality standards. Mothers were allowed significantly fewer times of being late to work, and they needed a significantly higher score on a management exam than non-mothers before being considered hireable. And as if this weren't enough, when they actually did hire the mothers, the subject participants gave them a lower salary than the non-mothers, and they considered them less well-suited for future promotion. All of this determined on the basis of a paper file. Yeah, biology matters. Motherhood matters. Even the perception of motherhood matters. So what should we do about this? Should we just make ourselves more aware? Not just. Should we make ourselves more aware? Should we respond to our heightened awareness by trying to do things differently? We can recommit to building a meritocracy, a system based on merit, a system in which you are rewarded for what you actually accomplish. We could recommit to judging our colleagues based on what they actually deliver, what they actually do. Well, friends, it turns out that this kind of approach also has been studied. Even with this kind of thought, we can turn to the research literature and see if this is likely to be a system that works. So that's what I do. I'm going to briefly mention now an article called "The Paradox of Meritocracy." It was published in a journal called Administrative Science Quarterly, and let me tell you that for a guy who started out as a linguist, that is a long road to travel to be reading Administrative Science Quarterly, but that's what my life has become, and that's okay. So imagine a critique of an organization that uncovers different treatment of men and women. And imagine that organization says, look, instead of spending so much money, so much energy establishing targets and figuring out how to achieve them and doing special things, why don't we instead try to build a culture of fairness in our organization? Why don't we, instead of risking a compromise of quality, instead of risking unfairness, why don't we instead make sure that we do everything we can to achieve a true meritocracy in our workplace? Let's focus on transparency, one might say. Well, it turns out this isn't quite as straightforward as we could have hoped. In fact, this article, "The Paradox of Meritocracy," makes that horrifyingly clear. Their article presents the results of some studies, 3 studies. They recruited close to 500 actual managers from different companies, and again asked them to evaluate the file of a fictitious employee at a fictitious company and to make recommendations about bonuses and promotions and terminations. And of course, they manipulate that folder. They change the sex of the employee, for example. But in this study, they also manipulated the description of the company. So they said to these managers, imagine you work for a company that is committed to meritocracy, that is committed to fairness, that is committed to seeing what people do and rewarding them for that. Sometimes they said that. Sometimes they said nothing about that aspect of the company. So the companies were described either as having a core corporate value by which they emphasize merit in their evaluations, or else they don't. And the researchers share the following result with us. The main finding is consistent across our 3 studies. When an organization is explicitly presented as meritocratic, individuals in managerial positions favor a male employee over an equally qualified female employee by awarding him a larger monetary award. This is what they call the paradox of meritocracy. You emphasize meritocracy, and the result is even less of it. Much of their article is devoted to discussing how this works. And there too, there's research to build on. We know that when people are led to believe that they are unbiased, when they are led to believe they are fair, when they are led to believe they are objective, that they are in fact more likely to behave in biased ways. An individual who is allowed to explicitly disagree with a list of sexist statements and then carry out a hiring process is more likely to favor a man over a woman than somebody who didn't go through that exercise. Then we have to think very, very carefully about what this means. But if it's a robust finding, if there's a literature on this topic, then it seems that the explicit pursuit of meritocratic organizational values is not equivalent with increased fairness. On the contrary, it seems to create even greater gender imbalances. And this research suggests that gender balance should not be pursued by focusing on the creation of a culture of fairness, but maybe by something else. So, we are treating men and women differently in undesirable ways. And saying simply to ourselves, shape up, do better, be more fair, treat them the same, doesn't seem to work. So where are we then? If the career paths that we have constructed treat women and men differently, then perhaps an explicit and deliberate response to that will be to continue to treat men and women differently. If we want our organizations to have the benefits of intelligence distributed equally across the sexes, then we have to acknowledge that we're not getting it today and that we have to do something different. And that different thing is not simply deciding to be gender blind. We actually do have to treat men and women differently to compensate for a system that treats them differently. Treating men and women fairly is not the same as treating them identically. We don't treat them identically today. I've shown you the literature. We are affected by bias. We are affected by implicit bias. When I can call a talk Confessions of a Sexist Man, I'm just admitting that I too have bias. I am affected by the stereotypes I am bombarded with. If I don't explicitly and deliberately work to counter them, then me and you and all of us will act in ways that treat men and women differently. So what should we do? I have a few minutes left, and I would like to tell you briefly about a couple of very specific kinds of actions that I think are worth considering. One is the project that was mentioned in the introduction that I did at the University of Tromsø. We were in a situation where about 40% of our associate professors were women and about 10% of our full professors were women. And that is not the default expectation. Why should there be that change? All through the career path, there's a gradual attrition of women. Maybe we would expect a gradual attrition, but 40 to 10? That's dramatic. So we did a project, we called it the Promotion Project. I can't describe it in detail. I do that on my blog if you're interested. But it has a couple of key properties. What we did is we recruited associate professors, female associate professors, where their department chair determined them to be within a few years of being qualified for promotion. And we worked with them on the promotion process. One of the most important things that we did is we actually simulated the promotion process. So they made a portfolio, they gathered their papers, they wrote the kind of letter they need to write. We actually engaged external people to evaluate them and to give them feedback so that they knew specifically what they should work on for the next few years to be able to get a real promotion. Now, interestingly, about 10% of the participants in the project, the feedback they received was, you're there, you meet the requirements, you should apply and get promoted. And all of those ones who got that feedback did apply, and every single one of them got promoted. And that also is an interesting lesson. The others got specific feedback about what they should do, so the simulation was very important there. And the second thing that was very important was that we then went into their department chairs and we trained their department chairs to do better career development work with the women in this project. So they tried to create the circumstances for them to do the things that they needed to do and to advance. And here is a case where I want to say to you that the work of making an environment better for women also can make it better for men, because those department chairs who were trained to work with the young women would come up to me and say, I never really knew how to support early career staff, and now I use these processes with everybody. Or department chairs would come to me and say, You know, some young men in my department came up and said they would like to have a trial evaluation, so now we're doing one for them also. The project that was originally focused on getting women to the top created a new environment of engagement in career development. And that, I think, is a big plus for a university. So that's one kind of example. I would say that's an intervention sort of in the middle of the scale. I'm going to very briefly round off my talk, if I can use 7 more minutes, or maybe 5. 7? Okay. I'm going to very briefly round off my talk with an example of a very, very soft intervention and a very, very hard intervention. And the soft intervention is the story of the Centers of Excellence. It's the story of what the Research Council of Norway did when they saw that result. Now, these centers get advertised every 5 years. You can apply, so there have been 3 cohorts of centers. The Research Council cares deeply about the fundamental issue, excellence, but they care deeply about gender issues also. So in the next announcement, they said, we're looking for the top groups, and they're going to march off like modern-day Vikings to Brussels and bring home the loot. And we would be surprised if there weren't some women who were suitable candidates to head these centers. Nothing more than that. That's all. In fact, they explicitly said, well, it will not be a criteria for selection. It would surprise us. And the next time they were, the second time they were announced, so the first time 0% women, the second time they were announced about 15% women. The third time they were announced, they still weren't satisfied, and they said again, we believe that some centers will be headed by women. Now, university rectors are out there competing. These are hugely prestigious centers. Every university rector wants them, and they try to figure out what's going to help, and they see a sentence like that, and they think, well, we better submit an application with a woman at the head. And in the third cohort, 25% of the centers are headed by women. Now, you might wish that it were 50, but in Norway nationally, about 25% of our professors at the time were women, and that pool of heads of centers is being drawn, or the group of heads of centers is being drawn from the pool of professors. So the heads of centers reflected exactly the percentage of women in the recruitment pool. That was accomplished with the softest possible intervention. Simply, we think probably some women should be there, nothing more. Can make a big difference. The last point I want to make is about the strongest possible intervention, quotas. And I want to not argue here for quotas, but I would like to argue a little bit about quotas. So, what is the most common objection to quotas? The most common objection to quotas is that they are somehow unfair. The thing I hear most about quotas is that they necessarily lead to a reduction in quality. If you use a quota, you will necessarily hire someone who otherwise wouldn't have made it. If you insist, as we do in Norway, of putting women on the boards of directors, you will necessarily lower the overall quality. That's the stereotype, right? That's the argument. But I'm here to tell you that this is exactly wrong. Research shows us that quotas can raise quality. How does that work? Okay, very, very briefly. In the journal Science, in 2012, there are 2 articles showing studies of the effects of affirmative action. And the effect of affirmative action that is revealed in those studies is that quotas, if you say in a job announcement, we would like to hire women, if you say, all other things being equal, we will hire a woman, or if you say the most extreme thing, we will hire a woman, those kinds of statements change the nature of the applicant pool. Those kinds of statements attract more highly qualified women to apply for the positions. So you cannot compare the applicant pool in a non-quota situation with the applicant pool in a quota situation. In fact, in the research that was published in Science, they achieved the gender balance they were looking for in the group without actually having to implement the quota, just by saying that they could. Because that so changed the applicant pool that there were stronger women in the pool who then got the positions. So simply saying, we encourage women to apply, changes the applicant pool. Simply saying, we think that at level N, the balance should be the same as N minus 1, changes the engagement of women. That's one example. In Sweden last year, there was a beautiful study published called Gender Quotas and the Crisis of the Mediocre Man. And this was a study examining the effect of quotas in political party lists. So the parties in Sweden make a list of candidates where every other one is a man and a woman. Sometimes that's called a zipper quota, right? And they had some ways of evaluating the quality of the groups, and what they realized is that the implementation of a zipper quota had two very important effects. One is it raised the overall competency of the group being put up for election, and secondly, it raised the competency of the group of men on that list. Now think about that. A zipper quota raises the competency of the group of men. What does that mean? How does that happen? It means that men of lower quality, so-called mediocre men, are being replaced by women of higher quality. The lower quality men are being moved along, and the group of men that remains is therefore of higher quality. So overall competency is raised because stronger women are replacing weaker men, and the group of men is also getting stronger. This is a classic example of the importance of making use of all of society's resources. To conclude, one way to hold women back is to keep treating them like men. Today, we treat men and women differently, but these different treatments are grounded in implicit issues such as bias. It is not possible to correct this by being more fair. We need to correct it by continuing to treat diversity diversely. One structural move for difference is to acknowledge the effects of quotas on women as a quality enhancement tool for organizations. At the broadest level, my message here today is this: your employees are different from one another at the level of individuals, at the level of groups. Those differences can be described, in fact, as cultural differences. And to enjoy the many well-documented benefits of diversity, you have to view cultural differences as not only legitimate, but desirable. You have to acknowledge that the structures that you use, structures about recruitment, evaluation, and promotion, treat men and women differently. And when you do, those girls in that auditorium in Oslo, who worked so hard that year to start their career as scientists, will be able to look ahead to students, to PhDs, and to professors, and see their role models. And they'll see them while they're standing next to those young boys, who will also look ahead and will also see the beauty of making a responsible use of the diversity of society's resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this tour de force. Now we will have half an hour for questions. I have this and perhaps this. Ráda bych vás požádala, jestli byste mohli používat...
I'd like to ask you to use the microphone that we have here in the room, because we don't have microphones that can go around. So I'd like you to, like, each anybody who wants to ask a question to come and use this microphone at the front.
Funguje? Jo, super. Tak.
Teď už mám správný kanál, já jsem byl na jiném kanálu. Okay, my name is Jiří Kolman. I'm a science worker responsible for human resources in the Czech Academy of Sciences. And my colleagues, when we discussed the issue of quotas, we found, we came across the argument that the selected person, for example, a team leader, would lose their legitimate position or would not be considered a legitimate colleague if they had been selected on the basis of quotas. In what way can you deal with this phenomenon? This kind of claim that the person would not be an equal if they were the result of a quota system, if they came through as a result of the quota system.
Right, thank you. Thank you for that important comment. One source of research on this topic is the experience of African Americans in the United States. So there have been quota systems promoting the possibility for African American participation in higher education for a generation now. And many African Americans have succeeded in academic careers. Last summer, I had the pleasure of participating in a course at Harvard for new college presidents, and maybe over a third, maybe half, were African American. And when I talked to those colleagues, without exception, they told me just the kind of story that you mentioned, that it sounded like it's almost part of their daily life that they are told, well, we know how you got here. And their response to that is to work harder and to have to do even better. And that's a classic response. In the case of promoting women through quotas, where I think you describe absolutely correctly a real situation, where we say, well, we had two good candidates, one man, one woman, and we decided to go for the woman because we want more. So what is my responsibility in a leadership position to in that kind of situation? My responsibility is to make sure that that person is capable of delivering on the expectations, to support them in doing that, to make sure that I know the best arguments for diversity. In the case of the academy, in the case of group leaders, I might say to the members of the academy and to society, I might say, listen, do you seriously think that intelligence is distributed differently across men and women? And maybe some people do think that, I don't know. But I think most people don't. And then I would say, well, look, I'm running the Academy of Sciences here. I gotta have the smartest people I can find. Because we're doing stuff that's gonna make a difference in society. And part of the way that I get the smartest people I find is to make it clear that I have a workplace that welcomes everyone. And part of the way I communicate that is by demonstrating that men and women have genuine career opportunities. So yeah, this one individual, we were aware when we hired them into these leadership positions that they were women. And if you want to say they got it because they're a woman, let me just remind you that they're at the Academy of Sciences. Not just anyone makes it this far. We're not talking about big differences here. We're talking about small differences and the legitimacy of building a team. Right? I guess the sports metaphors are easy to come by. You know, and I hardly dare make football metaphors because I don't know anything about football. From the impoverished childhood that I had. But, you know, you're not you're not required to hire 11 guys that are the best possible skill at one thing. You're allowed to put a team together. And you're allowed to put a team together, and you're allowed to say, in order to recruit from the whole society, I have to show that the whole society has a career path here. Furthermore, I know from research that, for example, having women lead teams makes women more engaged in the work of that group. It actually makes a difference. I know that in my role as director, when I gather all my team leaders, if I have diversity in that group, there's also good reason to think that they'll perform better. So I think it's our responsibility to make these arguments and to support that individual, and it's also our responsibility to move somebody along if that's not the right job for them. But I think it's even more important to emphasize that they're highly, highly qualified, and we're talking about a situation with small differences.
Další dotaz?
So hello, I'm Jaroslav Belčík from Czech Technical University. So I have a question concerning when grant agencies kind of reflect the situations when young scientists take a break during their scientific career because they care about the children. So I was wondering, maybe only to acknowledging the couple of years you spent with the child and having this reflected in your CV is maybe not enough. I wonder if Norway, there are some special programs for scientists, women or men, coming back from paternal break to start up the career, to access the grants better, specifically.
Right. Okay, so thank you. There's so much to say. There's so much to say about this topic, about how to help young women reboot or restart their career, for example, if they've been away for a few years with children. It is important to emphasize that that absence of a few years does have a career-long effect in science. In science, we evaluate each other on the basis of the number of publications we have. We evaluate each other on the basis of the number of citations those publications receive. And citations grow in a predictable pattern over the life of an article. And if you aren't producing articles for a period of a few years early in your career, you're never going to catch up with those who did. So we have to ask ourselves if that's really the way to identify quality. And it might be one way, but I bet it's not the only way. So how do we want to help women restart? How do we want to modify our systems of assessment in light of the fact that we presumably think it's a good thing for people to have children in a society, and we presumably think it's a good thing for parents to be with those children when they're young, and I personally think it's a good thing that applies to both men and women. Indeed, one of the things I would say about leveling this out is that we should engage at a societal level to create more opportunities for young men to spend time with their young children. But that's a ways down the road, perhaps. I don't know. I think that young men want to be engaged fathers, and I think that they are concerned about saying that to employers, and I think that it's good for society, not only for the women of the society, but for the children of the society, if we engage in that issue. Women who return need to find a way into a productive research environment, and that requires, among other things, good mentoring is one way of doing that. One thing I've introduced at the institution that I now lead in Oslo is that all new employees, administrative, scientific, everybody, has a mentor when they arrive, usually in a different faculty, in a different part of the organization so that they're not in their line of management, who helps them figure out how to get things going. And for the scientific staff, we do that also after prolonged absences through a very careful selection process. And those mentors sometimes help young women and young men find their way into research groups that they wouldn't find their way into themselves. So we need, one thing I think we need to do is have a very hands-on approach to personnel development, to personnel politics. But there are other things we could do also. We could imagine, well, we do imagine in many cases so-called start packages, where we're trying to recruit somebody and we say, we so want you to come to our university that your first 2 years you'll have a reduced teaching load and you'll have a PhD student and you'll get these kinds of special circumstances. You could have a reboot package of that type. In many places in Europe, we see repatriation packages where people have gone off to the States, for example, for 20 years, and we're trying to get them to come home. The EU has even had some programs targeted at such populations. One could use that as a kind of model, and not for bringing somebody back from exile in North America, but rather from bringing them back from exile in the nursery. So we have models for interventions to kickstart people at different phases of their careers, and I think that those are things that we could look to in this context as well.
Before I allow for another question, let me just remind you that Poland also has a grant scheme which is called the Bridge, if I'm not mistaken, and this Polish grant scheme allows for young scientists to return to work after maternity leave. These grant schemes are running for 2 years, and they are actually designed for people who are coming back into the science after maternity leave, and it allows them to actually get reintegrated in the science work. And this is actually an example from Poland, which is our neighboring country, and they do have this system in place, which is something that can be considered a benefit. There you go. The floor is yours.
My name is Sonia Štrbanova. I'm from the Academy of Sciences, a historian of science. And I would like to mention something what is very strange in our country. The women themselves are sharply against quotas. If you interview any or almost any scientist or manager, they would always tell you and answer the question about quotas. We don't need quotas. We are good enough to push ourselves through. And I think this is very dangerous because this one of the tools how to get better advance for women in positions in science are the quotas, actually. Right. So what to do in such situation when the society themselves pushes the women to be against quotas?
Yeah. Thank you for describing a situation that, well, it may be, did you say weird in the Czech Republic? Is in fact, is in any event, is not uncommon. There are a few things we must be aware of here. One is the following. Is it possible that, I don't know what the right number is here today, but is it possible, for example, that 90% of professors are men and 10% of professors are women? Is that possible without a quota? We've had quotas for centuries. But we've been so good at following them that it's been unnecessary to write them down. You don't make a speed limit of 500 kilometers an hour because nobody drives 500 kilometers an hour. You don't need rules when people already do what you want them to do. Men have enjoyed the benefit of quotas for generations. Society has been so good at adhering to them that it has been unnecessary to codify them. Those quotas have been implemented by developing hiring systems that are based on networks, by social segregation of the sexes such that networks are predominantly female or predominantly male. They have been implemented by building societies in ways where women have massively disproportionate responsibility for domestic work. And when we do let women into the academy, they get responsibility for academic domestic work also, and are very good at that. They organize conferences, and they pour the water, and they're just so good at that. It's wonderful having a few women around to take care of those things. So we have a system with quotas, and women who say they don't want quotas should be committed to then eliminating all quotas. And how are we going to do that? And part of my argument today is that we cannot succeed at doing that by simply deciding to be fair. That doesn't work. We need to intervene. And I don't say these things out of some kind of, fetish for some kind of masochism. I say them because I'm deeply committed to the view that my institution will perform better if I draw on the competencies and proficiencies of the entire society. And I want to find the interventions that make that possible. Now, young women, in my experience, are the strongest resistors to any kind of intervention. And it is extremely unpleasant to deny anyone their idealism. But women who are against quotas often say that they want to be evaluated based on their performance. And the problem is that they're not. They're not evaluated on their performance, and neither are men, by the way. We are all the victim of the way our brains work, and our brains are affected by the stereotypes we are bombarded with, and that generates biases of which we are unaware. No interventions is a strategy for sustaining those biases. It's very, very hard, perhaps even hardest of all for scientists to admit that we are incapable of objectivity. But that claim fails to account for a massive literature suggesting that indeed we are incapable of that. So I'm sorry that women are against quotas. At one level, I don't really care, because I need more women in my institution, because I want my institution to be better. And that's what I need to do to get it there. And I'm not asking you, it's not your job to approve of the strategies that I use. It's my job to create the context for getting the most out of the resources that society offers me.
If I may have a question myself, our experience in the Czech Republic shows that it may not be so bad at the very top level, because top managers may support gender equality for various reasons, prestige, the looks, whatever. But it's the middle ground, people as heads of departments or team leaders who appear to be most resistant. And so that's where you get the bottlenecks to, for actions to percolate, to actually have some effect. So how did you work, with middle management when you were implementing the things you were?
Right. So maybe that is, maybe that goes all the way back to one of the very first comments I made about the place of egalitarianism in Norwegian culture. Because it's really quite difficult to imagine in a Norwegian workplace anyone explicitly resisting the suggestion that gender balance is an important goal. So when I started this project, I used no energy whatsoever convincing any professor anywhere in my university that it was important in the face of the fact I mentioned, namely that women don't get all the way to the top, that it was important to try to redress that. There was no resistance to that idea at all. Yeah. So I think that part of the strategy directed against towards middle management, but also towards team leaders in research groups and so on, is the spin-off of explicit personnel development politics. Universities are kind of special. They're a little bit anarchistic. We're not really excited about leadership. We sort of want to be left alone. And I think that allows various kinds of problems to persist. And what I want to do at my university is to embrace the research conclusion that there is a correlation between the quality of the workplace and the level of performance. I think I get better teaching and research out of my people if I create good working conditions for them. And one of the tools, again, based on a serious body of literature, one of the tools for making a better workplace is the tool of gender equality enhancement. People like being in workplaces with gender balance. They like being in teams with gender balance. Large studies suggest this. So I want to use that as a tool for improving the quality of the workplace and thereby improving the productivity of the people who work there. And to do so, I need everybody in the whole line of management on board with that. So I spent a lot of time making that argument.
Tak a budeme mít čas ještě na jeden dotaz. Ano, tamhle vzadu, prosím.
Dana Nerudová, Mendel University. I am the leading researcher in Horizon 2020 project, which is coordinated by the Swedish University, and the project is about the gender equality in taxation. And I would like to mention another issue which is very much connected with tax quotas, and those are also the other tools how to support women in research. And this is my personal story, which happened to our consortium, and it's kind of a negative consequence, all those tools for supporting of women, because we were in the call with the colleagues and the consortiums, which were purely men consortiums, and we were purely women consortium. And in the same call, we won. And the reaction of the society, of the academic society, was that we won because we were only women in the consortium. And this is the issue which has to be raised, and this is the issue which we have to deal with, because otherwise women are always be against the quotas, because this is the negative consequence which we are facing all the day. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, I don't know. Do you have a son? That's part of my comment. You said in your introduction that this is a generational project, and part of that is pinning some of our hopes to young men. I think it's really hard, and I think it's really a serious responsibility of everyone in leadership positions all the way up and down the ladder to foster inclusiveness and to foster diversity. It's not enough to not punish diverse groups. And we have to embrace diversity. And that's a smart thing to do. It's going to make your group perform better. And my job is to make sure that people up and down, also especially men, understand that. But it's a slow going train.